bring in our panel. Joining us now is Thabi Leoka. She's an economist based in Johannesburg. Also from Johannesburg is Terence McNamee. He's a global fellow for the Africa program at the Wilson Centre. From Cape Town, Trust Matsilele. He's political analyst and campaign strategist. And Mike Law is a research associate with the political risk consultancy, the Paternoster Group, an African political insight in Cape Town. Guys, thanks so much for joining us. Trust, can we start with you? Lots of issues in this election, as we just heard. What is going to drive whether the ANC can hold on to a big majority that's been used to for the last quarter of a century?
I think it's a foregone conclusion now that the ANC will hold on to its majority. The question is the extent of the majority. Projections that have been done by a number of research organizations like CSIR and Ipsos point to around 56, 57, but maybe it will go even up to 60. So I think at this point, with having seen about 51% of the total voting tally being verified and declared, the ANC is leading comfortably with second, the Democratic Alliance almost having half of what the ANC is currently enjoying, and the third party, which is very much distant, having around 9%. So at this point, I think the issue of ANC majority is settled. ANC will comfortably have a majority and enough to govern outside the coalition.
And Thabi, obviously the threshold for the ANC is used to governing with a 60% majority, meaning things can get moved through Parliament very quickly. But there have been tremendous issues surrounding the economy, unemployment, corruption, of course, under the previous President Jacob Zuma. Is it likely that the ANC can shrug this off with a clean slate with Cyril Ramaphosa?
So I think that it is likely that the ANC can get around 60%. So I do agree that with Trust, that they could, if they do get, for instance, just around 58%, I don't think the ANC will view that as a successful election. Anything below 60 would mean that Cyril Ramaphosa is given one of the weakest mandates in the history of the democratic South Africa. You are right that South Africa is faced with many challenges: unemployment, poverty, poor education. We've seen service delivery protests as a result. We saw students protesting, wanting free education, and that's an indication that many people have been fed up with the ANC government, and they wanted change after 25 years of the ANC in power. So I think that President Cyril Ramaphosa has a big task ahead of him, and unlike the previous presidents, where South Africans were more tolerant and less impatient, I think that the pressure is on President Cyril Ramaphosa to act very swiftly and to implement the reforms that he spoke about before elections.
Mike Law, this is quite incredible if the results pan out that the ANC have got quite a considerable majority, considering the pressures on the ANC that we saw under Jacob Zuma, and some would argue continue under Cyril Ramaphosa with an underperforming economy, blackouts, etc. What's the opposition? Why can't the opposition seem to mount a challenge here when you would think that the environment gives them a really good chance?
Well, absolutely. That's the gist of the problem. South Africa lacks a strong, viable opposition party. The Democratic Alliance, the DA, who's the leading opposition, it still suffers from the perception, which they do have, which is a considerably white-dominated leadership, which obviously most South African voters don't identify with. So the Democratic Alliance has struggled to, once the Zuma years ended, and they spent those 10 years with a very easy election campaign to run, because you could simply criticize the ANC. When there was a change in leadership in the ANC, all of a sudden the DA was lost. They didn't know, they lost their biggest electoral asset, and they failed to find policy initiatives to come up with a viable alternative to the ANC. The EFF, they've made inroads today, they've made more gains, but they're still seen as a destabilizing force, a populist group, a splinter group of the ANC. So it's been a poor campaign by the opposition, and the results are very evident today.
Terence, obviously the Democratic Alliance hope to do better, but they have been successful in some respect in South Africa over the last 10 years or so in controlling some of the biggest metropolitan areas. We're talking about Cape Town, Johannesburg, Pretoria. So that's a sort of movement to the right, if you like, but also we've seen the success of Julius Malema's economic freedom fighters. What's going on here is the sort of slow erosion of support from the wide coalition of the ANC over time?
Well, I think that 18 months ago, everyone predicted that this was going to be an election of unprecedented competitiveness. But in reality, we are kind of stuck in a situation of status quo. It's business as usual. The EFF support has grown, but not exponentially and not by very much. The DA will be very disappointed by its result. But essentially, it feels like a bit of a damp squid. But in many ways, maybe that's what South Africa needed. It needed that stability. It needed that mandate for Ramaphosa. And I think that voters essentially gave him the benefit of the doubt. And let's see what he does over the next 12 and 24 months to push through the reforms that he's made such a commitment to over this election campaign.
Thank you, Trust. Before the next question, I just want to play to you a couple of reactions that we got from our correspondent, Angelo Coppola, on the streets of South Africa, because what's quite amazing on this 25th anniversary of liberation, that a lot of young South Africans aren't bothering to vote at all. Let's take a listen.
As it's my basic right to be voting, I think it's quite pointless because it's gonna take another I don't know how many years for us to actually realize change.
Being unemployed is a big thing for me. It's almost like a scar because in life you get your sayings that education is key. You have to do this in order to be successful, and then you follow the same rules, the same instructions, and then you find yourself where I am right now, being unemployed.
Trust. I mean, it was a long road to freedom in Nelson Mandela's words, and to see this next generation of South Africans rejecting going to the polls must be quite worrying for the society.
I think, 25 years after democracy, all these political disparate groups that we saw before 1994 are defaulting to their positions. As you see, even with what the DA that has been trying to build this coalition of different groupings to come under a banner of a united South Africa, which is what Mr. Maimane has been campaigning around. You can see that the kind of support they are losing, especially in this election, is from white conservative groups which are moving towards the Freedom Front Plus, which looks like a far-right white party. Which tells you that this imagination of a rainbow nation, what Nelson Mandela would have imagined, seems to be unraveling and are starting to disintegrate. Even towards the election, you would hear a rhetoric coming both from the EFF and the ANC, especially from some of the elements within the ANC, adopting some radical position that are anti-ANC, because ANC also, like what DA proposed to stand for, is an amalgamation of disparate groups. It advocates for non-racialism, and they call themselves a broad church, as they pull their support base both from the upper and the lower echelons in the society. So this imagination of a rainbow nation, 25 years into democracy, seems to be cracking. There's a hope that Ramaphosa will be able to bring back this imagined rainbow nation, considering the critical role that he played, especially around drafting a constitution that was welcomed by all groups that were having issues leading to the first democratic elections of 1994. So that's the hope that you have in Ramaphosa, a unifying figure who some believe is a reincarnation of Nelson Mandela.
Thabi, can you pick up on that? Because Cyril Ramaphosa, well known, of course, in the liberation movement, a trade union activist, someone who really helped drive the freedoms that South Africa has today, but he's also turned into a businessman, a very wealthy man now. Is he the right man at the time, or is it too late, considering the near decade that we had with Jacob Zuma and the problems that South Africa encountered during that time? Thabi.
So I recently looked at Nelson Mandela's top 100 list. So this is the list where he would choose the MPs and his cabinet. And Cyril Ramaphosa was number 2 and Thabo Mbeki was number 3. And that list contained excellent people. And if I look at that list and compare it to the current list of ministers, the current list of ministers unfortunately has many ministers who've been implicated in the various commissions that are underway in South Africa, be it the PIC Commission of Inquiry or the Zondo State Capture Inquiry. So as much as Cyril Ramaphosa has all the accolades, his CV is great, it ticks all the boxes, he doesn't come with the best of people around him. And even in the top 6, he is the only one that stands out as a person of integrity, and everyone else seems to be tarnished one way or another. So it's going to be a very difficult task for Cyril Ramaphosa to implement some of these policies that we've been speaking about when he has such a weak ANC, and he has to choose from weak ANC members, and these will be cabinet members. And many of these people were also, the most popular ones, were also ministers in the previous administration. And they did all sorts of terrible things that led to the demise of South Africa. So I think that, looking at one person, and unfortunately this is the one person that we actually don't vote for. South Africans vote for the party and not for the president. And this may confuse a lot of voters who think that they're voting for Cyril Ramaphosa because he's a great guy, but in effect they're actually voting for the very tarnished people within the ANC. With business, you look at different business cycles, and a different CEO does well in a different period of a business cycle. And I just think that I'm not sure whether Cyril Ramaphosa is the right person, the right president for this business cycle of South Africa, because you need someone who is extremely strong, somebody who will take the pressure and do the right thing without having to consider the ANC as in a sentimental way. This is somebody who has to put the country before the party.
Excellent points there, and anyone who knows their South African history knows that Cyril Ramaphosa was thought to be going to be the second president of South Africa after Nelson Mandela, but of course Thabo Mbeki ended up being that. Mike Law, before I come to you, I just want to play a clip of Cyril Ramaphosa because he's trying to draw a line under the previous administration and move forward. Let's take a listen.
This is a moment where we must choose to return to a path of conflict and anger, of corruption and also hunger, or we can choose to embark on a path of renewal and go forward to a future of peace, stability, jobs and progress.
So, Mike Law, I mean, can he do it? We've seen power cuts from the parastatal electricity firm Eskom. There's been corruption, state capture, which is a phrase that really the world has now linked with South Africa. This is a huge job, and as Thabi said, he seems to be, at least in a lot of people's minds, the only sort of positive candidate on this list of MPs that is going to be slated after these elections.
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily the only one. He certainly, I think, business and the public both view him as a very good president. But ironically, the better the ANC did today, the worse it would have been for the previous governing faction in the ANC. If the ANC had got 63% today, I think there's a strong argument to be made that Cyril Ramaphosa's power within the ANC would have been enhanced considerably. and its opportunity to act against the antagonists of the state capture project, various other miscreants, would have been enhanced. Today's results, although the ANC have dropped between 5 and 6% roughly on average, I don't think it will be a devastating result to the ANC. I think for the most part, they will at the same time be breathing a sigh of relief. It could have been worse. They could have been punished much more heavily at the polls and suffered the losses of provinces or even the country. So Cyril's position of power within the ANC is not as good as it could have been, but it's not completely powerless. And I think a lot of the foundations have been laid over the course of his interim presidency over the last 14 months.
Trust Matsilele, also there's been this big debate within South Africa for a long time now about land reform. Still, the overwhelming amount of land is owned by white people. Various attempts at changing that have failed. Cyril Ramaphosa is moving to the left, it seems, talking about expropriation. That also is a very important test, isn't it, for Cyril Ramaphosa to move forward and also keep this idea of a rainbow nation going forward.
Definitely, the issue of land reform is a very delicate one, not only for Ramaphosa, but for whoever I would imagine would win from this election. First, considering the number of people who are employed in the agriculture sector and agro-based related industries. So you have people in the agro-based industry running into hundreds of thousands. So, it creates employment, firstly to the South African underskilled population and also to the foreign underskilled population that is also in South Africa. And also there is also the contribution of the agro-based industry, not only to the domestic markets, but also to the regional markets. South Africa has effectively become the major supplier of agro products to SADC and other parts of Africa, like East Africa and also some parts of West Africa. So there's no question of the contribution of agriculture to South Africa's GDP because of the exports of the products, of agro products to the region. And also the issue of employment, which if tempered with like what we saw in Zimbabwe, would create unemployment and also would lead in few years, like what we saw in Zimbabwe, undermining the support base that the current government is enjoying. And whoever would take over would have to deal with the issue of unemployment. So the agro industry is delicate in 2 points. First, because of its contribution to the economy, and secondly, because of the issue of employment, but also because of the historical realities that black people were dispossessed of the land, partly because of apartheid and colonization. These issues need to be addressed. The question is, how do you go by it? Addressing a historical imbalance and historical undercutting of black people without necessarily tampering with one of the biggest contributors to the national GDP. That's where the challenge is for Ramaphosa. And should anything happen, whoever would take over after this election.
Terence McNamee, picking up on that point, South Africa always vies with Nigeria to be the biggest economy on the continent, but you've seen some backsliding from South Africa. We just heard there from Trust about how agriculture is very important in terms of the South African development community. It's also mining is still obviously very important. Huge wealth created under black economic empowerment, not necessarily shared equally. What's the task ahead regionally for South Africa and the economy, and also globally, because it was considered the Lion of Africa for a long time?
Well, I think the situation in South Africa and the continent as a whole is gravely disappointing, because experience the world over shows that if your big states, your regional hegemons are doing well economically, they tend to lift neighboring states with them. And for quite a long period of time, South Africa, Nigeria, big states in Africa have not performed well. And I think if Cyril Ramaphosa can achieve one main thing in his foreign policy agenda with this term, it's just to increase South Africa's stature diplomatically, economically on the continent. And that means engaging with countries in a more collaborative way. So if we talk about Nigeria, that means affording the same kind of access that South African companies have in Nigeria for Nigerian companies in South Africa. And I think Cyril Ramaphosa has that ability. He is very strong diplomatically. He's got a lot of experience in the international arena. And if anyone can recover and renew South Africa's reputation internationally and on the continent, it's Cyril Ramaphosa.
Thabi, I just want to widen it out as we come to a close. 25 years ago, democracy, huge hope in South Africa, Rainbow Nation. You're young, you're black, you're a professional. So much has been gained, but yet so much more to do. Where do you want to see your country go?
That's a very good question. I think that I'd like to see the inequality gap narrow significantly. I would like to see more job opportunities, especially for young people. I'd like to see more young people taking up leadership roles. I would like to see an ANC that talks about the future and not talks about the struggle credentials, because I think that is outdated. I think you asked a question that to trust. I don't think he heard it correctly, but it would be interesting to see what percentage of the youth didn't vote, and if that was a political party, where would it end up if you're looking, in the tally? Because that would be an interesting one. If the youth are not voting, it says something about the caliber of political parties that we have, and there's a message there that the youth are not satisfied. So I'd like a country where, when I was at university, Nelson Mandela was the president, and what we discussed on campus was how we're going to build this country into being one of the best countries in the world. And we had an anchor in Nelson Mandela. So I want leaders who are that influential, where the youth look up to them and are inspired by their leadership. And we've had 9-10 years of a lack of leadership and an anchor, a moral anchor and an anchor where we our integrity is aligned to or is mirrored by the leadership that we have.
Thabi, that's going to be the final word, because there's hope there as well as the challenges for the future. And as we know, South Africa is still a fantastic country. Having visited many times, it is just an incredible place to go and an incredible society. But that is it for this edition of The Heat. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. See you soon.